Our hope is that by the time this video goes live, it will be completely useless. That's right, that's what we are wishing for, because what we will go through in this video is who do we want to nerf and who do we want to buff at the beginning of the 4th reset of this season in a couple of days. Essentially, check out the results in the raid, check out the results in Mythic Plus. At this point, we have seen enough. We have seen 3 full weeks of the season. We know who is strong. We know who is weak. We don't have to wait for specs to get their tier set bonuses, to get their crafted weapon, to get their item level up. We have seen enough at this point, so it's time to look at what do we want to see put back in line, either made stronger or made weaker. Why we say we hope it's gonna be useless by tonight, it's because generally, whenever Blizzard releases their balance tuning or any kind of patch note for the incoming weekly reset, it's either before the weekend or after the weekend. So on Friday or on Monday. We had nothing on Friday. We had radio silence, so now it's Monday. Now it's the next target for any possible announcement by Blizzard when it comes to balance tuning for this incoming reset. So as we approach that time, it's when we're gonna think for ourselves, based on the results we have seen so far, who do we think needs some help, or who do we think needs to be rained down a little bit in power. Now, interestingly enough, when it comes to nerfs, when it comes to who do we want to see brought back right now, when it comes to the raid, there aren't actually that many clear OP performers. If you look at the current performance in the raid, even if we were to look at the actual good results, not the the absolute best of the best, but some 70 percentile plus, you can see that the gap from the bottom to the top is quite narrow. Assassination is at 5.48. Arcane is at 5.78. It's a 300k DPS difference, which is like a 6.5% damage gap from top to bottom, which is very balanced at the moment. Yes, there is this outlier. Yes, Destro, you would think this is the one that needs to be nerfed. Destro is benefiting here and there from a few fights where they can gain more value from their Havoc, their multi-targeting of bosses, for example Lumitar. They can do it very well also on Soul Hunters, where they can gain massive value compared to the rest of the specs. But when it comes to their actual pure, unfiltered, single target value, they are middle of the pack. So it's mostly just the damage profile of the spec. It will be kind of hard to just nerf their 2-target hitting with Havoc without nerfing anything else about their toolkit, unless you want to shorten the duration of Havoc just because it's performing this well. The only other 2 specs you would be thinking about holding back in the raid are these 2. Marksmanship and Elemental, who has been doing overall very well, even in single target like Fractilius and in single target like Plexus Sentinel. They are still first, and they have been doing extremely well. So if you wanted to target them, you would have to go and hit their single target spells, primarily things like Earthshock for Elemental Shaman or Lava Burst, which would also go and hit their multi-target cleave though, so Earthshock would be more primarily single target. For marksmanship, it would be a bit harder because this is their damage. All of their damage practically comes from 2 buttons, and those 2 buttons are also used in AoE, because Black Arrow and Aim Shot will still do AoE damage in their toolkit anyways, so it would be kind of hard. Perhaps you could lower the base damage of Aim Shot, but then buff the spread damage of Trick Shots. So in the end, the AoE damage stays the same, but the single target damage of Aim Shot goes down a bit. That could be the one only way to rain down the current power in single target of marksmanship. But in the raid, as mentioned, there isn't really much we are thinking about when it comes to nerfs. A couple of specs, maybe Destro in their multi 2-target really, power and the single target of Elemental and marksmanship. When it comes to Mythic Plus, that's a different thing, because in Mythic Plus you can't just look at this damage. In Mythic Plus you can't just go, oh well, who has the top damage is clearly the one that needs to be nerfed. After all, according to this, it's Elemental who has potentially the highest damage. And even if we don't look at the potential, but the average, according to this average, Sub has very good average damage. Why not? Arms has very good average damage in Mythic Plus. So What are we doing? Are we nerfing Arms Warrior? We can't even read a single letter of Arms over here in terms of popularity in keys. So what are we gonna do? Nerf this? How many of these supposedly top damage Arms Warriors do we see in here in these comps? That's Fury, and this is Fury. There is no Arms in here anyways. So it's a bit harder to balance the Mythic Plus results because you can't just go off of their damage only. Whereas in the raids, it's a bit easier to just compare damage value with their power. What, however, seems to be clear right now in Mythic Plus is that by purely going on the popularity that we have already been seeing quite a bit, Frost DK is clearly the most popular pick. It's literally in the most popular compositions. In all of the 30 most popular compositions, it's the only DPS spec that is present in every single one of them. Others are juggling for positions. You have options. You can pick Havoc, Demon Hunter. You can also pick Ret. You can pick Assassination. You can pick Destro, Elemental, Shadow Priest, and then the other two popular, Havoc and Arcane. But there is still some variance, not for Frost DK. Frost DK is ever present. So that's obviously the #1 target for nerfs in Mythic Plus. Primarily their AoE damage in Mythic Plus. That would be the first nerf target when it comes to Mythic Plus specs. And I think that's also kind of the bottleneck of the season. It would open up more options, more comps if you were to nerf down Frost DK and make it more challengeable by other specs. So we don't see another reason really to nerf any of the other currently well-performing specs like Arcane, like Havoc, like Destro. It's really just the main culprit when it comes to DPS being Frost DK. We don't see a lot of reason to nerf tanks right now. As mentioned, when it comes to top comps, you have 3 tanks all being played right now, being Prot Warrior, Prot Paladin, and Vengeance Demon Hunter, and you also have a decent representation of Brewmaster Monk as well. So in terms of nerfs, we're not really seeing a reason to nerf the tanks right now. Same goes when it comes to healers in Mythic Plus. That would be a question more about buffing the healers rather than nerfing them. So at the moment, happily enough, really just the one target for nerfs you would want to see in Mythic Plus is just Frost DK. Not really when it comes to tanks, not really when it comes to healers. It seems to be a bit more centered about the current extreme popularity of this one DPS pick. Now, something more interesting to gossip about is gonna be buffs rather than nerfs. That's where we hook up our tanks, our reserves of Hopium, and a bit of Copium too. We need that flavor for some of these specs. In who do we want to see buffed in the raid and in Mythic Plus based on their performance. So we have said that based on their performance, we didn't see that many specs in need of nerfs, besides a handful, maybe Elemental and Marksmanship in their single target and Destro in their small multi-target damage. When it comes to buffs, well, it's always kind of cheap. You can just go at the bottom of the results. You will find Feral, BM, Balance, Devastation, and you're like, easy, just buff them, right? Simple. Now that's where it gets a bit misleading, because when you look at the sims, you do see that these bad performing Balance and Devastation, for example, they seem to be middle of the pack. Where it gets misleading is that they are in the middle of the pack, but many of the specs below them are essentially the worst performing of the other hero talents not being played, or they are the worst performing ones that don't include their category, which in this case for Devastation and Balance Druid is ranged. You see that while they look middle of the pack, they are below Shadow, they are below all 3 mage specs, they are below 2 of the warlock specs, they are below 1 of the hunter range specs, and they are also below elemental shaman, which means they are below every single other ranged DPS. Any other ranged DPS class as an option right now that is better than Balance and better than Devastation at the moment. So for them, it is perhaps a bit easier to figure out what to buff, and even easier for Beast Mastery. You can see here Beast Mastery is even lower than Devastation and Balance. So For these three range specs, the answer is indeed simple. Just buff their damage, in particular their single target damage. More or less by 5 or so % would bring both of them at around 5.9, which would be challenging marksmanship, the mages, and slightly below the warlocks, but it will be competitive enough to be doing decent damage compared to where they are now in the raid. So the simplest answer for who do we want to see buffed is BM, Balance, and Devastation in single target, to bring up their raid results more in line with what we mentioned being quite balanced, for most of the other specs being within 6% of each other. Something between a 4 to 5% damage buff would also bring these specs back in line with the rest. The bigger asterisk would be to Feral Druid, because unlike those range specs we mentioned that were doing already poor damage, Feral isn't. Feral supposedly is in the top 10 of results. Technically, it's even in the top 5 of classes. They should only be below Elemental, Death Knight, Warlock, and Mage. And then you would have Feral. Yet, their performance right now is lagging down quite a bit. So that's more tricky, because if their sim damage is already top 5, how do you buff them? They are already supposed to be doing well, but they are not. So how would you go at buffing them, right? It would be a bit more complicated, right? Because you see, for example, when they do have the chance to play a target dummy in single target like Fractillus, that's Feral, number 4 in DPS. So their single target works. When they are allowed to single target, they are doing damage. However, it is not when they aren't limited to single target, when they have to spread and move quite often, like on Soul Hunters, they are back in the bottom half. When they are on a multitude of adds that need to be bursted down, Feral drops to the complete bottom. On Soulbinder, the adds live a little bit longer, doesn't matter, they are still doing terrible. On Lumitar, where you have the option to hit a couple of targets, but still primarily single target, they go back to doing much better. So for them, it's less about being buffed in single target and more about being buffed in multi-target damage, especially burst multi-target damage, which is not, to be fair, that relevant in the raid. Even though that's the reason why they end up being at the bottom in the overall results, it's still not something you would value too much anyways. But it is still something that would require just a slight buff, like a 3% damage buff to Feral to bring them back in line with the rest of the specs. So when it comes to the raid, besides the small nerfs to the single target of Elemental and Marksmanship and the multi-target damage of Destruction, we would like to see the buffs of Balance, BM, Devastation for single target only, and Feral Druid in their multi-target, especially quick damage multi-target in the raid. Now, in Mythic Plus, we are again in the same consideration of this not being purely about damage, because again, if you look at the damage, technically speaking, specs like Shadow Priest are at the bottom of the damage meters right now in Mythic Plus. Elemental Shaman overall is in the bottom half. You also have questions about healers, for example. You know, Mischievous Monk is very not played in Mythic Plus, despite having one of the better HPS values in group content. So how would you even go at buffing them? In other cases, it could simply be a matter of different specs in the same class. Like right now, Arcane is meta. Doesn't mean that Frost Mage is terrible and needs to be buffed just because Arcane is doing well. Or the same could be said for Unholy DK, which is doing very good damage, it's just that Frost is doing slightly more. There are also other problems in Mythic Plus, like for example being target capped, right? It's not like there are not much talk about buffing a certain spec when one of their biggest limiters is them being target capped to 5 or more often to just 8 targets. And in those cases, as mentioned, it could be some severe design issues, like the 2 warriors being target capped, for example. Hunters damage profile for marksmanship, for example, very high upfront, front-loaded AoE damage in Mythic Plus, which is not that useful in a group, especially in high keys. Balance Druid is back of having their issue of being extremely squishy without a Discipline Priest saving their ass every 10 seconds with a massive shield. So finding who to buff in Mythic Plus is truly truly difficult. It could be even a matter of flavor. Like in my case, for example, I would be buffing Windwalker, in particular the single target damage of Windwalker, which is quite weak compared to what they can do in AoE, even though they are somewhat target capped in AoE as well, which is another weakness of the spec in massive pools in Mythic Plus. I do think that regardless of their current situation, I don't even want to see them meta anyways, but Balanced Druid especially should get some buffs to their tankiness, to their defensive power. Same goes to Devastation Evoker as well, reasonably squishy. But you see, if you want to see the glass half full, at the moment the values of damage in Mythic Plus are very balanced. They're very even right now. There are specs that are pumping a lot of damage. They're not meta because their damage is low, right, based on their results. You can see from this that even if you were to look at the specs tier list based on their current popularity in high keys, some specs at the top don't even have higher damage than specs trending towards the bottom, like Feral or Affliction or Outlaw, right? So it's not really just about their damage right now, which is why it's so much harder to balance. So while the raid is much easier to pinpoint who does well and who does badly based on numbers, for Mythic Plus it's gonna be harder. It's gonna be a matter of defensives mixed with possible raid buffs, value mixed with possible utility, crowd controls, interrupts, as well as the damage profile, more so than their actual overall damage. So how much single target do you have? How much single target do you have while you are hitting 10 mobs and you're also trying to hit the one guy with the most HP? So funnel damage or priority damage, which is very good, for example, in Arcane, in Havoc, in Assassination, and completely terrible in specs like Outlaw, for example, or Affliction. So that's our answer, unfortunately, for Mythic Plus. The answer is, who knows who should be buffed? There are a million reasons. As I mentioned, I would like to see more single target damage for Windwalker in Mythic Plus, which then becomes hard because you don't necessarily want more single target damage for Windwalker in the raid. So how do you balance the two? Only buff the single target of Windwalker for Mythic Plus, but not for the raid. And then you have the easy cop-out cheat answer of, how do we buff the specs? Just remove target caps. Remove them from Windwalker, remove them from Arms, remove them from Fury Warrior, remove them from BM, Hunter, Marksmanship Hunter, Shadow Priest, Affliction, and Feral. They technically aren't target capped, but they are target capped in the sense that their cap limit is how many dots can they spread, or rather, how long does it take them to spread all the dots. So in short, giving them an easier time to spread all the dots immediately, to be able to pump damage immediately in a pool and not take 10 seconds to set up all of their dots by tab targeting and getting nauseous trying to find all the nameplates and dot everything. That would also make it easier for those specs in Mythic Plus. After all, you have specs like Assassination that can very simply jump in with things like Indiscriminate Carnage and throw out 9 different dots in 3 GCDs because of that talent alone, something that these other dot specs don't have. So things like those for the specs, but it's more tricky to balance things in Mythic Plus. But we do still see a reasonably balanced and even situation right now, outside of the outlier we have mentioned in terms of damage being Frost Decay and overall popularity as well. That was the one we would like to see nerfed. And then for buffs, you have a more wide variety of specs that could do with some help, whether it is defensive power that they are lacking right now or damage profile that they are lacking in Mythic Plus as well, compared to the more straightforward results in the raid right now, where you have about 3 specs overperforming just slightly. Though we're still not talking about some crazy situations that really call for a nerf immediately because they are very out of line. It's still pretty balanced at the moment, but if we were to look at and try to find one of the specs or some of the specs to be balanced, it would be those. Destro in their 2 target damage in the raid, Marksmanship and Elemental in their single target damage, and then when it comes to buffs, BM, Balance, Devastation for pure single target, and Feral Druid for their multi-target damage. That's what we are wishing for in the next round of balance tuning, which, as we mentioned, we hope is gonna come out basically by the time this video is out for the next reset. So at this point, all that is left to do is to wait and see what Blizzard will do either in this weekly reset or at this point hooking up on Hopium. Surely by the next reset we will have announcements of more incoming balance tuning. But for today, on this Monday, this is all we have to do. Just speculate and guess and hope for some changes. So for today, it is now time to leave each other. We are starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with of course everyone else who have been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now with these fingers out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime we went from massive shining sun in the background to cloudy and almost about to rain. Not complaining.